Hi everyone, I'm Any New Province, and this week we're playing Orzhov Grim Harvest for Net Benefits, the series where we explore the benefits of net decking in Pauper. A few months ago, I had the pleasure of playing He Who Is in the Water's Orzhov Pestilence list. This list by Adams does look similar, but it eschews the plan of locking your opponent out with Pestilence in favor of using some more versatile tools. It gains access to those tools by trimming on copies of Pestilence and going up to 4 copies of Grim Harvest. Grim Harvest costs 1 and a black for an instant that returns target creature card from your graveyard to your hand, which would actually be pretty bad, but you can recover it. Recover means whenever a creature is put into your graveyard from the battlefield, you may pay 2 and a black. If you do, return Grim Harvest from your graveyard to your hand, otherwise exile this card. You do have to carefully play around the exile cause of Grim Harvest, but if you can do that, you gain access to an amazing engine that allows you to recur creatures from your graveyard after they trade in combat or die to removal. We've even included 1 copy of Stinkweed Imp just in case your creatures aren't dying to removal or trading off in combat. Stinkweed Imp costs 2 and a black for a 1/2 flyer, and whenever it deals combat damage to a creature, destroy that creature. The way Stinkweed Imp helps to enable Grim Harvest is with its Dredge ability. It has Dredge 5, which means if you would draw a card, instead you may put exactly 5 cards from the top of your library into your graveyard. If you do, return this card from your graveyard to your hand, otherwise draw a card. Once we've dredged Stinkweed Imp a few times, it turns our graveyard into a veritable toolbox. We can point to the creature we'd like to put onto the battlefield, get it back with Grim Harvest, and try to get it removed so that we can loop it with Grim Harvest again. While I wouldn't call this deck a Pestilence deck, it does run a single copy of Pestilence alongside some other hosers to shut down strategies that Pestilence may not be able to. Pestilence costs 2 black for an enchantment, and at the beginning of your end step, if no creatures are on the battlefield, sacrifice Pestilence. We can get kind of fancy and play around this contingency. Its ability is the really exciting part. It lets you pay 1 black to deal 1 damage to each creature and each player. If you time this right, you can turn Pestilence into a board wipe, leave your opponent empty-handed, then turn the corner to win the game. Because we're so heavy on Grim Harvest, we're able to run another board wipe that we can potentially recur multiple times to keep wrathing our opponent's board. That board wipe is Crypt Rats. It costs 2 and a black for a 1/1 rat, and you can pay X to have Crypt Rats deal X damage to each creature and each player. You can only spend black mana on X. Another one of our great silver bullet type hosers is Coalition Honor Guard. It costs 3 and a white for a 2/4, and while choosing targets as part of casting a spell or activating an ability, your opponent must choose at least 1 flag bearer on the battlefield if able. Usually we'll be the only one with a flag bearer in Coalition Honor Guard. Finally, if wrathing our opponent's board repeatedly with Pestilence and Crypt Rats and picking up all of their pump spells and auras still doesn't shut down our opponent's creature-based strategy, Kami of False Hope definitely will. Kami of False Hope costs 1 white for a 1/1 that you can sacrifice to prevent all combat damage that will be dealt this turn. A 1 mana fog effect on a creature's body isn't very exciting, but we can loop Kami of False Hope with Grim Harvest for 6 mana a turn, potentially locking our opponent out of ever taking another effective combat step. We're always going to be trying to draw into our silver bullets, our board wipes, and our Grim Harvest, so we're going to need some card advantage and value to make sure we find them on time. Our card advantage package starts with Dusk Legion Zealot. It costs 1 and a black for a 1/1, and when it enters the battlefield, you draw a card and lose 1 life. Creatures that replace themselves are already excellent, but what makes Dusk Legion Zealot interesting is that you can keep looping it with Grim Harvest to draw even more cards. All it asks is that you have 2 mana, 1 of which is black, to have it enter the battlefield, lose another life, and draw another card. We're also running 4 copies of Thraben Inspector, which costs 1 white for a 1/2, and when it enters the battlefield, you investigate, which means you create a clue token that you can pay to and sacrifice to draw a card. Thraben Inspector is sort of fine card advantage all on its own, but it synergizes particularly well with our next spell, which is Core Skyfisher. It costs 1 and a white for a 2/3 flyer, and when it enters the battlefield, return a permanent you control to its owner's hand. When we can't recur our Dusk Legion Zealots and our Thraben Inspectors with our Grim Harvest, Core Skyfisher is going to do an excellent job of that for us while attacking in the air for 2 and hopefully closing out the game. Finally, we have Custody Squire. It costs 4 and a white for a 3/3 flyer with the Will of the Council ability, which means when Custody Squire enters the battlefield, starting with you, each player votes for an artifact, creature, or enchantment card in your graveyard. Return each card with the most votes or tied for the most votes to your hand. Custody Squire usually looks a lot like a Gravedigger in this deck, but it is wicked that it can buy back a Pestilence that we may have lost by not having any creatures on the battlefield on our end step. That's no big deal, we can rebuild very well on an empty board. Whenever we rat the board with Pestilence or Crypt Rats, we lose a little bit of life in the process. For that reason, we have to include some life gain cards. That life gain package starts with Arishan Cleric. Arishan Cleric costs 1 and a white for a 1/3, and when it enters the battlefield, you gain 3 life. You're giving up a little bit by running Arishan Cleric over Lone Missionary, but you get an extra couple of points of toughness to make sure that you go into the long game against opponents with creatures that it can't attack through a 1/3. Our other life gain spell synergizes very well with Grim Harvest. It's Aven Riftwatcher. It costs 2 and a white for a 2/3 flyer with Vanishing 3. Vanishing 3 says, this creature enters the battlefield with 3 time counters on it. At the beginning of your upkeep, remove a time counter from it. When the last is removed, sacrifice it. Also, when Aven Riftwatcher enters the battlefield or leaves the battlefield, you gain 2 life. Aven Riftwatcher is doing a ton of stuff. First of all, it's just a 2/3 flyer to help close out the game with our core Skyfishers. Also, it's going to get sacrificed to gain us that other 2 life. That's going to allow us to loop a Grim Harvest, or if our opponent doesn't want to remove one of our creatures or trade with one of our creatures in combat, allowing us to get the Grim Harvest back to pick another creature out of our graveyard. The rest of our deck is some very efficient interaction. We have to try to keep the board clear for long enough to draw into one of our hosers or one of our board wipes. That package starts with some Chainer's Edicts. Chainer's Edict costs 1 and a black and causes target player to sacrifice a creature. That's pretty good, especially if we've wiped away all the small creatures we don't care about with something like Pestilence or Crypt Rats. What makes it even better is that you sometimes get a second activation out of Chainer's Edict. That's because you can cast it for its flashback cost, which means you can pay 5 black to cast it from your graveyard and then exile it. We're also running a single copy of Doomblade because it's one of the best removal spells in the format. It costs 1 black for an instant that destroys target non-black creature. Our last non-land card is the fantastic catch-all removal spell Journey to Nowhere, which synergizes really well with core Skyfisher in this deck. Journey to Nowhere costs 1 and a white for an enchantment that enters the battlefield and exiles target creature. When Journey to Nowhere leaves the battlefield, you return the exiled creature to the battlefield under its owner's control. The Skyfisher synergy with Journey to Nowhere is even better than usual in this deck because we can commit a Journey to Nowhere onto a creature that we might not be able to deal with in the early game and then recur it with a core Skyfisher when we have a Wrath at the ready. Alright, let's have a look at this mana base. First, we have 2 copies of Ash Barrens, which only add generic mana, but you can pay 1 and discard them from your hand to search your library for any basic land card and put it into your hand. Just a good little bit of mana fixing. We have 1 main deck Bazooka Bog for a little bit of graveyard hate out of our main deck. We have 2 copies of Kibera Crossroads, which enter the battlefield tapped and gain you 2 life. When they're untapped, you can tap them for white. We're running 4 Orzhov Basilica, your black and white Karus. They enter the battlefield tapped. When they enter the battlefield, you return a land you control, like a Kibera Crossroads or a Bazooka Bog, to your hand. When they become untapped, they add black and white. Our last non-basics are 4 copies of Scoured Barrens, your standard Pauper duels in black and white. They enter the battlefield tapped, gain you a life, and when they're untapped, you can tap them for black or white. Finally, for our basic lands, we have 3 plains and 7 swamps. We're really prioritizing getting Arishan Cleric or Dusk Legion Zealot down early to start blocking our opponent's aggressive starts. Alright, let's have a look at this sideboard. First, we have a few copies of Core Sanctifiers for blowing up our opponent's artifacts and enchantments, recurring them with Grim Harvest, and blowing up more of those artifacts and enchantments. We have 1 copy of Lone Missionary for really upping our life gain game, and we have another copy of Aven Riftwatcher for doing the same. We have another copy of Stinkweed Imp for getting in the way of our opponent's huge creatures or flyers, and another copy of Chainer's Edict if our opponent is boggling up. We have 2 copies of Fairy Macabre for hosing our opponent's graveyard without having to pay any mana for it. We have another copy of Custody Squire for those really grindy matchups, another copy of Coalition Guard if our opponent is on all auras or pump spells. We have 2 copies of Prismatic Strands if our opponent is going all in on something like a Tribe or a Kiln Fiend, and we have 2 more copies of Kami of False Hope because they do a very good job against creature damage based decks. And there it is, Orzhov Grim Harvest by Adams. Congratulations again on your finish in the challenge this weekend. We're going to take this deck into a league at twitch.tv/AnyNewProvince. We're there every Monday night at 7 p.m. Atlantic time playing competitive Pauper decks. Before I go, I just want to remind you that you can like the video or subscribe to the channel down below. I'd seriously appreciate it. It's a great way to let me know you've enjoyed everything, and it really encourages me to keep making great Pauper content. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this deck tech, and hopefully I'll see you on Monday night.